Welcome back, boys and girls, to another day of our Read Aloud. So today we're going to read our first chapter in Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Yesterday I introduced you to this, and remember, Wayside School is built 30 stories high with one classroom on each floor instead of being 30 classrooms long and no height. So it's built super tall instead of like a normal classroom across, which means they have a huge recess field because they have all this land. And remember, we're going to be talking about the class that's on the top floor, the 30th floor of our school. So the first chapter today is Mrs. Gorf. Take a look at Mrs. Gorf here. It's important you see her picture. Let's read about Mrs. Gorf today. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. Does anybody else have an opinion? She asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I do not allow crying in this classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. So she wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet, and when they went home, they were too scared even to talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, God bless you, when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue, and Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf now had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, the 3 Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Evans. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children are bringing her apples. So he walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He now saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor, and the apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time the left one, then the right one, and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Mauricia. Let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the art teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it up on his shirt, and ate it. That's the end of chapter 1. Tomorrow we'll be meeting Mrs. Jules for chapter 2. See you then. Have a good day.